Before we begin, thank you very much to Women's Plus Size Convoy for pitching in over on Ko-fi. That's not a size I expected. Now, don't get me wrong. Power to the plus size women out there. I'm glad you have your sizes of convoy available to you. You deserve it. That's just... That one took me aback. That one was weird. Okay, but thank you very much for the contribution. Thank you everyone who has been pitching in this silly little game you've apparently chosen to play, because it is helping to keep the lights on. It is helping to keep the daily content coming, and I appreciate it very, very much. So, as long as we are talking about contributions, as long as there's a cash topic going on, let us discuss cost saving. So we know Transformers has done a lot over the years to kind of like drive down the cost of actually producing these things for a lot of reasons. You know, like we're hitting a ceiling as to what people are willing to spend on these little things. We have things like rising production costs, rising material costs, rising shipping costs, tariffs. So the cheaper you can figure out how to make the product, the more likely you are to be able to still provide said product at a price that is not going to be offensive. Granted, I think we've crested that horizon at this point. I do think there are toys out there right now for Transformers that are egregiously overpriced. But we know the easy stuff, right? We know the easy stuff when it comes to, you know, cheapening down a toy. We take out less, you know, we got rid of the gimmicks a long time ago. That's a very obvious one. You know, we started hollowing out parts. That one, you know, we used to have those nice bicep pieces that were like two pieces screwed together, and now we just have that one solid bicep that's hollow on the inside. We got that all over the place now. You know, it's what ruined Twin Mill for me. Like, his legs are just shells with no side or back to them, and it's very ugly and very disappointing. But that's the easy stuff, right? Easy stuff. Anyone can point out that there's less paint, they're smaller, the plastic's thinner, you know, they're more hollow. There's so many ways that Hasbro has snuck a budget cut in that sometimes it goes completely under the radar, and you don't even notice it until, you know, some idiot on YouTube points it out to you. So let's go take over a few of them. There's not in any order or anything. It's not a top 10. There's just a few things I would like you to notice for a bit. Now, as far as like cost cutting, the most egregious and the most widespread one was done during Dark of the Moon. We've talked about this before. So there was this like real huge drive to make toys as complicated as possible during Dark of the Moon in order to make them as accurate as possible. And that's fine. You know, you go for that, whatever. But cramming gimmicks into them on top of that made them incredibly complex for what they were. So you end up with disasters like Mixmaster and Mudflap, you know, amongst all of these different toys. And it just, no, they just weren't pleasant to mess with. And they were fundamentally badly engineered. Don't get me wrong. The fact they function is good engineering, but it just wasn't pleasant to mess with. So Dark of the Moon had this huge idea to simplify the toys down to where they were actually fun to transform again and still look like the characters. And that was overall a step in the right direction. Though, admittedly, when you do that, you are cutting a lot of cost out of the toy by simplifying how they transform. Because now there's less R&D going into how they actually function. And one of the more egregious things I think happens today as well, and no one really talks about it enough, is the fact that the part count gets smaller. Smaller part count, less time in assembly, less cost of labor. That's a way of cheapening it out as well. But Dark of the Moon did something that I think is like a very good smokescreen. You know, it's like a magician's trick, you know, where they're doing something with their hands over here, so you can't tell the cards flipping around their hands over here. Because Hasbro got the bright idea to take the gimmick of the toy and, remove it from the overall figure. So Skids here has a gigantic weapon strapped to him. That's where all of his, gimmickry is. His gears, his springs, his whatever. You know, Transformers Prime would do the same thing when it got into its deluxe, you know, its mainline iteration. But what happened was that massive gimmick taken out of the toys noticeably shrank. They were a little bit smaller than they were before. And the idea here was to prepare us for Transformers just being that size. Because we got them down a little bit, we shrunk them down just a little bit, and now they basically stayed like that ever since. But it's almost clever. It's devious in the fact that they figured out how to shrink the toys without us really noticing, because it came this big old gimmicked up plastic accessory to go with them. And then the next toy line that comes out doesn't have that accessory, but they didn't make the toys larger than the previous line. Went by a lot of people. A lot of people missed that. I point it out whenever I can, because I think it's one of the biggest little tricks Hasbro ever pulled on us. Now, for another one, and this one is ongoing for like decades. We can talk about this for decades. One of the best places they like to cut the costs on things is with the packaging. So this is the quote-unquote environmentally friendly packaging they started doing during Legacy that I did a whole video railing against. Now, my approach then was from a collector's viewpoint, because the open packaging with no window to protect the figure made it very difficult for both retailer and collector to protect the item inside. Basically, nothing was mint and sealed box anymore because none of the boxes were sealed, meaning elements got in, you know, the box would get dusty on the inside where it's nearly impossible to clean it. So, you know, that made it a headache. The boxes were noticeably a lot flimsier because now they had these little jagged edges and overhangs, and they just didn't have that extra level of like rigidness that window added. And all of this is wrapped up in this nice little, like, we're trying to be environmental shell. And you know what? I agree with that. I agree with attempting to be more environmental. But to take a toy line where you know half of the toys are just going to get junked by the parents after the kid is bored by the figure, to take that and go like, well, the thin plastic in the box is the problem, it just seems just a little bit hypocritical to me. So I never really bought it as an excuse. Now, that said, there's the other angle to take from this. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out, you know, it's just way cheaper. And I called them out back then, you know, that this really was just a cost-cutting maneuver, because obviously ditching the window meant it removed a process from the manufacturing again. You don't have to have someone, you know, you don't have to have a printer printing and cutting these plastic windows for all the packaging. You can just leave the gap open, you know, and that's what they wanted, because it's just, it doesn't seem like much. It's like, literally in the terms of economics, it probably only cut like maybe 2 cents off of the overall cost of making the box. But that adds up over the course of 100,000 figures. That adds up. So we railed against this one because, you know, if you want to be environmental, that's fine. But like, if it was to cut costs, be honest about it. That's all I really wanted, and they weren't. So I called them out. But really, this has been going on for a long time. You know, these days the toys are back to having, you know, windows, but there's still things that are, you know, and they still do try to be a little bit more environmental with like the cardboard backings instead of the old bubbles. But who remembers the rattan ties? Because this is where this kind of thing started. Now, again, they got rid of the metal wire because of, you know, environmental reasons. This is why I called Hasbro out on their packaging not being environmental, but being cost-cutting, because they've done it before. Which is the whole thing I should have pointed out in the original video. There's precedent and history for this. The rattan ties replaced the traditional twist ties. And honestly, good. We hated the old twist ties. Like, if you mess with anything from like the 2000s, oh god, those twist ties were so annoying. Like, because it was like, they were impossible. They were so hard to cut. We'd be literally be starting up forum conversations about what's the best household tool. What's the, like, without having to go and buy something myself. What is the best thing around the house that could actually cut through these things because they're so annoying to untie? And my answer was always like nail clippers, especially toenail clippers. You didn't want to go in there with an X-Acto, or you didn't want to go in there with like heavy scissors because you didn't want to risk damaging your toy. But toenail, the clipper, you get the corner of it in there, it gets through it, it cuts it pretty well. So we came up with our answers, but really it doesn't take a genius to figure out that a strip of rattan, which is literally just plant, a strip of rattan is way, way cheaper than a metal cable coated in plastic. There's a manufacturing process to just creating that twist tie in the first place. The rattan tie, way simpler, way cheaper. Now, these days, we've gone even cheaper than that. Transformers are using the same little stretchy plastic bands that pretty much every toy uses these days to keep a toy on its packaging. So this one continued, and I don't think we can get any cheaper than this outside of just like throwing it loosely into the box and hoping the cardboard hangs on to it all the way from Vietnam. But there's one more case of the packaging being a source of cutting the budget, and this is again where you will probably picked up on some of it, but not all of it. So modern packaging, especially if you look at Studio Series, does a lot to try to get as many languages in there as possible. Now, on one hand, cultural inclusivity, I'm all for that too. That is not an issue. The issue here is that this is very different from how things used to be done. So take a look at the 2000s, or let's go even earlier than that. How about we go earlier than that? We'll go to Beast Wars in the mid 1990s. So in 1996, Beast Wars toys came out. Packaging was all in English for us in the US. So you got this nice full bio on the card. The logo looked clean and nothing was crowded. But they printed trilingual packaging for Canada and Mexico that had French and Spanish. Now, they did this for Canada because specifically there are regions of Canada, hello Quebec, that legally require French to be on the packaging because that is their official legal language. So they needed French on the box in order to sell it to Canada, and they weren't going to make a special run of this packaging in French just to send to Quebec. So instead, they printed one that went to both Canada and Mexico. That way, they only had to have 2 print runs, but really they had to have 3 because when the toy went to the UK and went to other parts of the world, now the packaging needed to have all of the languages, as many as they could fit, which is why European toy bios ended up being like 1 sentence long. And that gets kind of continued. Eventually, we get into the era of the trilingual package for all of North America, and now today there's usually 6 languages on the box. That way, they only need 1 print run of packaging, and they don't have to design anything special for any other region. That is a huge cut to cost because it means like 1 longer production run of something is so much cheaper than like 3 individual runs to cover everything that they used to do. And you notice even Takara is getting in on this. They're sharing the budget for packaging now because a lot of their Transformer packaging is the Hasbro stuff with just a sticker over it for Asian legal languages. So it's one of those that like has been like slowly building up to the point where we are at now, where pretty much everybody who buys a Transformer gets the exact same box with the exact same everything on it. The part you're not thinking about is the fact that without space for a bio because of all these languages, Hasbro no longer pays anybody to come up with all that stuff. So originally where there would have been writers that were actually like just here, your whole thing is just come up with a fun bio so a kid who flips the box around in a store sees and reads about how cool this character is. Well, you don't have that anymore. So there's one more person Hasbro's not paying. Cuts the cost, both at home and abroad. Okay, so this is all packaging nonsense. This is, you don't care about this. How do the toys get cheaper? Well, did you know all these are the same guy? So, doesn't take a genius to figure this one out either. We've had so many toys that have been coming out lately where it's just retool after retool. And granted, that's how Transformers have always been, but you do have to admit, in the last 5 years or so, it's become so much more egregious. When you look at these four right off the bat, they don't look like they could all come from the same toy. They all have very different body types, but they all kind of transform into a similar shaped box with wheels. So someone at Hasbro has to figure out how to get as many uses out of this. We used to, like 20 years ago, you'd always expect one repaint of every mold that came out. Maybe two if it was a good popular mold or they had a really good homage idea later on. But now, geez, you aren't surprised to see like 4th and 5th iterations of figures. It's kind of crazy how much gets reused. And because of that, there's a lot less engineering going on. There's a lot less R&D going on. What would have originally been 4 completely different molds are now just all kind of crammed together because, well, it's close enough. We add some parts here, change up a head here and there, and it works. It's close enough. It checks the box, okay, good enough. The character's done. We'll get another one out 20 years from now. Sorry to you Crankcase fans. The only, and I will acknowledge, some of these characters would only exist if they were retools. There's no way they're doing Crankcase as his own completely unique figure, even though the new one really doesn't satisfy, does it? Gotta have those shoulder guns. He's a trigger con. Don't work. But this is, again, one you probably noticed. You probably noticed this one. But one that kind of is related and something that kind of falls into the same category. The borrowing of all the parts. So here we have 3 Target Masters, all from the Titans Return line. They're all wearing the same pants. This is, okay, so retooling has gotten extreme. Not only in the fact that we can get 4 vastly different characters out of the same base mold, but what they're doing with remolding is so much more extreme than it used to be. And it's not just the fact that things are heavily retooled. We're used to that. It's not even borrowed engineering, which is what, if you remember Energon Starscream. And the whole point of Energon Starscream was it's the exact same engineering as G2 Cliff Jump or G2 Smokescreen, the jet. Same exact transformation scheme. But it's not the same toy. They don't share any parts. Well, nowadays, we kind of skirt that line a little bit. You do have toys that are completely new, all new parts, but the transformation is borrowed from a pre-existing figure, which again means they don't need to R&D whole new transformation engineering. As long as they keep the math the same, this tab goes here, this part is so many millimeters long, so this has to be so many millimeters long, and this has to be this many microns in width, so it can tab into that. As long as all that math is the same, they can make everything look completely different, and they get a whole new toy out of it, sometimes a whole new character. So, yeah, it's retooling, kind of, but at the same time, now we have another level of this, which is sometimes little parts or internal parts are reused. You have toys with the same internal structure and skeleton system because the transformation just works with it. So might as well reuse it. You've got Transformers where little things like biceps or thighs are borrowed from another toy. They don't have any, real connection, but they're just generic parts and they fit the job that they need on another figure. So they go ahead and use that mold in order to build a completely different figure, which is 80% new and 10% retooled. And sometimes it gets weird. It gets really weird. So we've skirted this line a lot now. And the toys are trying to reuse their parts so much that it becomes hard to figure out what is a retool and what's not anymore. So that was a little bit more out in the open too, but I don't think people realize how how far it goes. You know, it does get ridiculous. Like there are like satellite sound waves that share parts with car sound waves. It's like how? Like just because they can. Now, I don't want all of this to be inherently negative. Yeah, I'm kind of calling Hasbro out a little bit on cheapening their toys in ways I think we wouldn't notice, but really, there's a few ways that they do that are making the toys overall cheaper, but it is actually beneficial to everybody. One example is they are trying very hard to make toys now with just solid plastic to create their color. That on the surface means less paint. And, that's not a terrible thing. It does get rid of things like, like you remember how many times we would have like huge chunks of the car of a vehicle mode of a transformer completely covered in paint except for just the windows left undone because that's just how they wanted to do the clear plastic. We don't get that nearly as much anymore. In fact, I'm seeing more and more toys coming out where the clear plastic is just an insert that is just put in from the inside of the toy and is not affecting the rest of the surrounding plastic at all, meaning the plastic color can be correct. Everything looks more consistent. And obviously you have advantages like the fact that the paint will wear and scratch. Bare plastic, much harder to do that. So this is not totally a bad thing, like, okay, fine. Yeah, make as much of the color out of just plastic tooling as you possibly can. That's overall a net positive, and I wish I had a better example of this than Hound, because there are some that get really clever with it, and there's some where it's like, wow, it's a very colorful toy, but there's barely any paint. Fortunately, I couldn't remember any offhand. But it is a thing now. It's like a direct thing that Hasbro has said in the past. Like, yeah, like we have a goal of like using less paint and using more solid colors. And you know what? Honestly, I'm for that. If it makes more durable, better looking toys and saves them some money at the same time, have at it. I just reviewed Brawl. Should have used Brawl for this. Brawl has next to no paint apps on him. Still looks good in all of his forms. Still does everything he needs to do. So, you know what? Cool. Great. Man, I should have used Brawl for this. It's like his treads have absolutely been something that they just solid painted back in the day, and instead they're molded. Should have thought of that. I'm going to leave you off with another positive one. And this is one that's very, very sneaky and very obvious, but you don't even think about it sometimes. So we know the hollowing plastic is like the most egregious thing Hasbro does in order to cut the cost. But what about the ones that are happening right in front of you and are actually a feature? You know how many times in reviews now I look at a toy and go like, oh, I've talked about everything else. Okay, time to spin this around and show everyone where all the 5mm ports are. Now, for someone like this, for a toy like this, they're all over the place. It's a Junkion. You know what parts are being held on by the pegs at this point. But even in the vehicle mode, you can see 3 along the side, because the wheels are also 5mm pegged. You can see ones in the robot mode that are exposed, as well as ones that are being used at the time. If I recall right, you got like 8 or so across the robot mode. If like the back has some, it's nuts. But you got to think about it. They're little holes they're creating in the toys. Yes, the holes don't go all the way through most of the time, but it's a little spot where they can gouge a little bit more plastic out and, sell you something that has been notably hollowed. It's sneaky. It's a little bit sneaky, but you know what? Like, at least this one has a point. At least this one has something to it. And before you say like, well, like they're creating a pocket inside the toy that's actually more plastic. No, usually when they do this, that 5mm post is incorporated into like the structural stuff on the inside of the parts, meaning that it's plastic that would have been used anyway. They're still hollowing it out and getting a use out of it. So it's not always a bad thing, you know? And overall, the cost cutting isn't a bad thing for us because it allows us to continue getting Transformers. If they were still as like high quality and thick and assembled as old figures from like 20 years ago, you'd be looking at either like $35 for a deluxe glass toy these days. My apologies to the international fans where they're already $35. Or you'd be looking at like a 4-inch figure at best, you know, like Transformers are complicated. To play devil's advocate just a little bit, Transformers are very complicated. A lot goes into them, you know, and you have to appreciate them for what they still accomplish despite the cost cutting. You know, I will argue about the paint on Brawl because there's not much of it, but I acknowledge that creating a paint mask at the factory, which is essentially like this silicone sleeve that leaves all of the parts that need be painting exposed and protects everything else, is sometimes just as expensive as creating full molds, meaning cutting out the paint process or limiting the paint process does cut out a huge section of manufacturing. So yeah, do what you need to do to limit that. I will play devil's advocate just a little bit because there's so many expenses we don't think about. But these are just a few ways that Hasbro's gotten these little cost cuts by you, and I'm sure they'll figure out more at some point. But I've gone way longer than I intended to for this topic. I get rolling on things sometimes. You'll forgive me. But thank you everyone who made it this far. I do appreciate it. And as always, I will see you next time.
Hello everyone, I am Astral Agent Magnetar, a Tokusatsu VTuber, and I am streaming 4 times a week over on Twitch, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday afternoons, and a special late night one on late Friday/early Saturday. So come watch, come hang out, and let's make an impact together.